Hello, I'm Jan Newharth, Chair and Chief Executive Officer of the Freedom Forum. Welcome to First Five Now, a Freedom Forum conversation series that explores topical issues and features current newsmakers who are using the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment to guide their work. Following an unprecedented week in the history of our nation, we present to you a conversation examining how the interpretation of the First Amendment became a nationwide debate. We are joined by Freedom Forum fellows and First Amendment experts, David Hudson, Lata Nath, and Jean Policinski, who will recount the week's news, from the violent breach of the US Capitol to the banning of President Trump and others from various social media platforms, and discuss the connection between these events and the role of the First Amendment. This program is brought to you by the Freedom Forum, which fosters First Amendment freedoms for all. Our vision is an America where everyone knows, understands, values, and defends the freedoms of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. And now please welcome our moderator, Kathy Trost.
Thank you, Jan, and welcome everyone to First Five Now. I'm Kathy Trost. I'm Chief Engagement Officer at the Freedom Forum, and we're here today with a really special program to discuss a momentous week in American history where the First Amendment played a prominent role. And while we've all heard a lot about the First Amendment recently, there's been a lot of confusion about what the First Amendment actually protects and what it doesn't protect. And to be honest, it's complicated. But today, help is on the way. We are joined by our team of Freedom Forum First Amendment experts who are going to unpack some of the misconceptions and the true misunderstandings that are swirling on social media and probably at a lot of dinner table conversations around the country. So welcome, David Hudson, Lata Nath, and Jean Policinski. I'm not going to run through their biographies, which are very extensive, but please visit our website, freedomforum.org, to learn more about them and to follow their work. So let's just dive in. And my first question is going to be to Jean. We know that the First Amendment protects peaceful assembly from government interference. That's one of its superpowers. It's the thing that fuels our rights as citizens to protest and to speak freely about causes that we value. But participating in a violent riot is not a peaceful assembly. It's actually against the law. So Jean, last week, we did see a protest turn into a violent riot at the US Capitol. And what I think is confusing to people, help us understand, at what point did protesters lose their First Amendment protections last Wednesday? And how does a protest march go from a legal event to a crime?
Well, as long as the people in any given march, particularly that one, were expressing themselves, giving their viewpoint, their ideas, they were fine. Marching up to the Capitol from a rally, still fine. Outside the Capitol building, were they on the grounds? Were they suddenly trespassing? They began to lose their First Amendment protections. And certainly when they violently attacked police lines, broke into the Capitol, and really when they were on the Capitol, inside the Capitol building, they did not have free speech protection for their ideas, for what they were saying. So it really depends not so much on what you were saying, it's the conduct under which you were saying.
Mm-hmm. Lata, David, is there anything you want to add to that?
Just that's a good point, that there is a distinction between speech and action. And when your hateful rhetoric might be protected by the First Amendment, but when that crosses the line into taking action, I think when they went over those barricades, then you're no longer protected.
Absolutely. And something else that confused a lot of people last week was when Twitter and Facebook and other social media companies banned President Trump and others from their platforms. And Lata, I want to go back to you on this question. What did the president say or tweet that caused social media sites to block him? And why didn't that violate his First Amendment rights to free speech?
Well, I believe the particular tweet or post that got him blocked were when he responded to the rioters with what came across as a very supportive message. And that was the point when I'm not sure when Facebook banned him, but that was the point when Twitter decided to ban him. And that was followed by Facebook and YouTube. And while the First Amendment does prevent the government from censoring us or punishing us for our speech, it doesn't actually apply to private actors. And Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, these are all private companies. They have the right to set their own policies about what kind of content they'll allow on their platforms. That's in fact their First Amendment right. So in the case of President Trump, the platforms banned him because they felt that his posts were contributing to the risk of ongoing violence. And they made the decision that taking those, the whatever value is inherent in allowing a public figure's words to be analyzed and discussed was outweighed by that risk of violence and physical harm. And so when they did take down his posts and when they did block him from their platforms, it wasn't really a First Amendment issue.
Okay, I hear you. Twitter and Facebook bans they don't violate the First Amendment because those are private companies, right? And the First Amendment only protects government from censoring your speech, but that's still really confusing to people. Many feel that the platforms are targeting or even censoring only certain points of view or muzzling only ideas that they don't agree with. And some people believe that it's actually time for us to regulate companies, for companies to be regulated in some way, because they have such huge power and such impact on our public lives, our public discourse. What's your take on that, Lotta?
Well, I do agree that they have a huge amount of power on public discourse. And while the decisions that they make, they're not a First Amendment issue because they're private companies, they're what I like to call First Amendment-ish issues because they impact what the First Amendment is meant to protect, the free exchange of ideas.
Right.
But I'm not sure if the solution is to either force these private companies to host every kind of speech that's allowed by the First Amendment or crack down on anything that they allow posted on their sites. Instead, I think the real problem might lie in the fact that these companies are so powerful. If you leave aside someone like the president, who still has a lot of platforms available to him to speak, for other speakers and publishers, when they're banned from Twitter, that means they're banned from the public conversation entirely. And it's incredibly hard for other social media platforms to compete with these established giants. So I honestly think that the call for regulation isn't a bad one, but instead of a call for speech regulation, it really should be for antitrust regulation to make sure that these companies don't have this almost unilateral power over the conversations that we have. Even Twitter's CEO, Jack Dorsey, has said that the internet should not be controlled by any one individual or corporation.
But honestly, again, it's a hard issue for people to understand, right? It seems to many, and we've seen it play out in people's comments all week and much before that, that people feel like that there's censorship going on, that people are being censored on what they consider sort of public pipes of transmission of thought. Do you believe that there's going to be more pressure to regulate as a result of some of the recent activities?
Well, I think there will be more pressure. There's been a lot of pressure lately, but I think we need to be very cautious about this. Anytime government gets involved in forcing someone to speak or not speak, I think it complicates matters very greatly. One of the things to think about, if you get the government involved in sort of a First Amendment nanny role of making sure people can do this and that, they're going to set certain standards for companies. They're going to need to know, the company's going to need to know how to operate. Well, they're going to need to know that. They set that. Then it becomes a government matter, probably, to enforce those things on you or me or anybody else. Right now, if I violate their terms of service, or as they've judged President Trump to have done, what's the worst that happens? You get banned for a short amount of time or for life or whatever it is. Go ahead and violate a government standard on speech. You can face a prison term. You can face a fine. I mean, suddenly government, the power of government when they get into this arena is going to set certain standards and goals. And apart from the ideological part of his government trying to control what we want, you don't want to break those. It ramps it up. And I don't think people have really thought about the impact of having government suddenly intrude on when or I can or can't speak. And, to the point about these places having so much power, I always have two words: MySpace. There was a point when MySpace dominated the way we had what was effectively social media some years ago. And what happened? Somebody came along and invented a better mousetrap or a better social media feed, and bang, MySpace is now, I don't even know if it's still operating. So I understand that people are concerned about the real power that these companies have. But if the web has taught us anything, it's that innovation is going to come along, and they're going to be either old hat or face a strong competitor they never anticipated. So
Yeah.
part of me is like, hold on, we're not done yet here.
To any of you, is there an easy way to say what that terms of service is? We throw these words around like, well, Facebook and Twitter have guidelines, and certain people violated their guidelines. What's the kind of things that will get you thrown off Twitter or Facebook?
In this case, the guidelines that they were talking about when they banned President Trump were things that promote or incite violence, harassing other users. Each site has its own list of guidelines, but essentially they kind of boil down to categories of things that harass or attack other users. Some sites ban hate speech, but they all define it slightly differently.
Right.
So terms of service is a pretty broad term for anything that they don't want on their site.
Right.
In today's environment, I think we don't want to lose sight of the fact that if you make a threat, you violate everybody's terms of service.
But that's a great point, Gene. And I wanted to ask David, what constitutes a threat online?
Well, the United States Supreme Court has essentially defined true threats as any statements that constitute a serious expression of an intent to cause serious bodily harm or other significant type harm. That same definition applies whether offline or online. There's really three unprotected categories of speech that I like to say are cousins in the First Amendment family. There's fighting words, incitement to imminent lawless action, and true threats. And all of those come into play when we're talking about harmful speech that might deal with violence. Fighting words is defined as words which by their very utterance inflict injury or cause an immediate breach of the peace. That essentially applies when A speaks a personal insult directly to B, and then B may react with violence. Incitement, which that's been associated here in the news lately, that's when A speaks to the world at large, and then somebody immediately reacts unlawfully and violently. And then true threats is somewhat different. That is where somebody directly utters a serious intent to express harm to a specific individual.
Okay, without putting you on the spot, have you analyzed what the nature, whether there was an online threat that rose to one of the levels of those three categories that triggered the actions by the social media companies last week?
Well, the one that would be most directly applicable, I think, would be incitement to imminent lawless action. The problem is that is a very, very high standard under the law. The United States Supreme Court in Brandenburg versus Ohio in 1969 and Hess v. Indiana in 1973 essentially imposed a very heightened imminency requirement that the speaker intend to incite imminent lawless action, and then it results temporally very quickly. And so it becomes very difficult to actually pursue incitement charges consonant with the First Amendment, particularly when the speaker says something that's inflammatory or incendiary, but then also later says something like, well, don't commit violence. So for example, then candidate Trump in Kentucky, in a case, had a rally, and there were several protesters there protesting Trump. And so candidate Trump says, get him out of here, get him out of here. And so some individuals engaged in physical violence and physically ejected these individuals. At that point in time, candidate Trump said, but don't hurt them, but don't hurt them. And so the 6th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals essentially held that his words did not rise to the level of incitement because he had this caveat, don't hurt them, don't hurt them.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to prove incitement. I think there's enough to bring charges. I'm not sure there's enough to actually get a conviction.
Correct. And we'll see how that plays out. But David, stay with me. What another misconception about the First Amendment is that it applies to what you can say as an employee. If you're the employee of a private company, and you got something on your mind, you want to protest something, that's your First Amendment right. But what about all the people who were protesting or who were in the Capitol last week and participating in what turned in to a riot, who lost their jobs, who were fired? Wasn't that a violation of their First Amendment rights?
Well, it goes back to what Lotta was talking about, the so-called state action doctrine. The First Amendment only protects us from governmental abridgments of free speech, not private abridgments of free speech. So when a private employer arguably infringes on somebody's free speech rights, that's not a First Amendment problem because it doesn't involve the government. Now, you could argue perhaps that it's a little bit of overreach by the company. It may violate some sort of contract. There might be some sort of contract type claim. Some states have protections for certain off-duty employee conduct, like in the past when employees were disciplined for smoking off-duty or some such. And then the state of Connecticut has very broad free speech protections, even for private employees. But that's a matter of state constitutional law, not federal constitutional law. So bluntly stated, the First Amendment does not protect private employees.
Right.
Most states have some statutes under the heading called wrongful dismissal, but they tend to protect us against things like being fired for our race or because of our religion or skin color. And then some further ones that have to do with some very specific things about maybe not contributing to a 401k, for example. If you decide to do that in Texas, that doesn't allow somebody to fire you. But the political speech, presumably protected by the First Amendment from government interference, is really left open, I think, David, Lotta, from private companies that choose to do it. The one fellow who was fired because he wore his company badge very prominently. I think there might have been an expectation that he was engaged in some kind of First Amendment conduct. First of all, he was in the Capitol building, which may presumably bring criminal charge, but the company simply said, we believe in First Amendment rights, but this guy put our company in a bad light. And there's something called at will. It means you don't have a contract and your employer can fire you for pretty much any reason at that point. Private employer.
Yeah, basically, Kathy, it really depends on state law. It's not, there's no federal constitutional law claim.
I wanted to ask Jean. Jean, you've done a lot of interviews in the last couple of days, and maybe Lotta and David as well. But Jean, has anything surprised you that people have asked about a misconception about the First Amendment?
Well, I think it starts with your opening question about how can they do that? Don't I have a right to free speech? And again, the answer is they're a private company. And then there's really a question of what can we do about it if we don't like that situation? Okay, if that's the law now, how do we make the law change? And I was surprised at the ideas that people have come up with. I did an interview with a reporter from Fargo, North Dakota. 2 or 3 legislators in their state legislature had filed a bill allowing anybody in South Dakota or North Dakota to sue Twitter or Facebook, whatever, if they ever got banned. And again, those little things we all never read, we just click, I accept, all that boilerplate. Somewhere in there gives Twitter or whatever, Facebook or whatever, when you agree to go on their site, they set the rules. And when I brought that up with somebody who was, I think, an advocate of the bill, they were like, oops, they hadn't thought about that. So I think, one of the things that's happening here is people are taking a lot harder look at what can I say? And sometimes they're surprised. David, there's actually less protection for government employees, right, under the First Amendment than there is for the average citizen.
Yeah. Government employees under the First Amendment have a fairly limited free speech rights as well, as a result of particularly of the U.S. Supreme Court's 2006 decision in Garcetti v. Ceballos, where Justice Anthony Kennedy, writing for the court, said when public employees make statements pursuant to their official job duties, the First Amendment does not insulate them from discipline, which essentially means it's breathtakingly broad categorical ruling. If you're engaged in any official job duty speech, no First Amendment protection. That's a very troubling ruling to a lot of us First Amendment advocates.
Yeah. Okay, we've said a lot about what the First Amendment doesn't protect, but let's turn this around for a minute and talk about why we should care about what it does protect and how it does foster, really unique freedoms for our citizens in our country. And Jean has said something that I think is really powerful, that protest is the way we talk to ourselves as a nation. So from all of you, how do we move forward in these really troubled times and ensure that the rights and the values of the First Amendment continue to be important, continue to help us talk to ourselves as a nation, and also help us live safely with our deepest differences?
Well, the founders set up the First Amendment as a kind of self-correcting mechanism for our society. And I think we need to keep that in mind. It is how we talk to ourselves as a nation very often. And more in I'd say the last 4 or 5 years, we're turning to our fellow citizens for change. We're not going to the politicians first. We're not waiting for the legislature to act or wake up in some cases. I think the thing to keep in mind is that we're facing some restrictions, but they're a very narrow part of our speech, violent speech and true threats. David laid those out. Think about the vast area that we can, and we can go onto public sidewalks. We can march along public streets. We can get together large groups, or we can go on our own and say something. We can stand in front of the Supreme Court with a sign. And so I think if we look at how changes occurred in America, from women's rights to civil rights to immigrant rights to labor rights, it's very often come as a result of a large group of people or a sizable group of people expressing themselves in public. And I hope we keep that in mind. It's a huge tool to make things better.
Well said. Lotta, you want to add anything to that?
I would. And here I am actually just stealing something that Gene wrote, like in a column of his. The real tension of the First Amendment is that you have this promise, you have this potential to produce positive change, but sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes the pace of change is slower than you want it, or it's faster than other people want it. And so I almost think that when just acknowledging that the First Amendment, like, it can frustrate you when people you disagree with, when your opponents are using it for change that you don't want, that can be disheartening, that can be frustrating. But it's a tool that all of us can use. And until you cross the line, as like the rioters did, into using it violently, which at that point, that's not speech anymore. That's taking lawless action. It's until that point, it's a tool that is available to all of us. And so when we protect the right to use it, we're not necessarily agreeing with a point of view we find abhorrent. We're just saying that, like, this is so valuable that we need to preserve it for every single one of us.
Well said. A muscle that we need to exercise responsibly and protect. David, you get the last word.
Well, I think what we need in our nation is an increase in civic education. I really think we need a greater appreciation and understanding of the 5 freedoms in the First Amendment and really the rest of the Bill of Rights. And we also fundamentally need a appreciation of civility and the ability to appreciate and listen to different points of view. Those fundamental free speech principle in all of First Amendment free speech jurisprudence is generally no viewpoint discrimination by the government. But I think we would be wise as citizens to also respect different viewpoints. It's sort of like what the late, great Nat Hentoff wrote, free speech for me, but not for thee. There are far too many people in society all across the political spectrum that think that they're right and don't want to hear another point of view. And I think we as a society progress when we're willing to listen to different viewpoints.
Thank you so much. That's all the time we have today, but I want to thank David and Lotta and Jean for joining us today and really helping us get to a better understanding of what the First Amendment means to us, not only as citizens, but as a country. Special thanks to our donors. It's your continued support that allows us to put on programs like this. And please join us for the next First Five Now on February 11th at 2 p.m. when we'll interview Ian Rosenberg, the author of a new book called The Fight for Free Speech, 10 Cases That Define First Amendment Freedom. And for more information on all our programs and initiatives, please visit us at freedomforum.org. Thank you for joining us today for First Five Now.